Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another JaruJaruJ reaction. And, oh, this is gonna be a big one. This is Who is the Roaring Knight? All candidates analyzed. And this is a massive 3.5 hour long video. So, I had to get ready for this one. And just today, I've already had my lunch. I've started recording like 12:45, and I won't be finishing this until later because I'm going to record this in one shot, but obviously it'll be released in several videos, depending on like how long, probably 4, who knows. Now, you may remember that a little while ago, I did a reaction to KemiBoyG's video where he speculated on who he thought would be the knight, or, you know, more accurately, that there wasn't just a single night and that there was going to be a different night, quote-unquote, for every day of the week that we're playing through in Deltarune. And he had, trying to think back, like 5 or 6 different people? But yeah, yeah, that's not what Jaru was doing. So yeah, I don't want to spend too much time just, you know, talking in the beginning of the video here. So we should probably get this thing started then. So yeah, of course, as always, original video will be linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason, as well as links to all the other parts of this reaction when I, you know, upload them. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day, and if you like this video or any other video that I upload, I would very much appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel, because, you know, all those things help in the algorithm, and also because I'm hoping to hit 5,000 subscribers sometime this year, hopefully. And after this behemoth of a video, granted, it's not as long as Molly Starr's, you know, device theory, but, you know, it's still a huge undertaking for a single day. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
Hello, my name is Jaru. Today I'm talking about Deltarune. There will be major spoilers for both Deltarune and Undertale, so please play them both before watching this. This video is the 5th in a series, so I highly recommend you check out my previous videos in order to get some important context. This video will consist of me discussing what is arguably the most important character in all of Deltarune, the Roaring Knight. I will be discussing all of the potential candidates for who this knight might be, while also giving my thoughts on who I think is the most probable. And to be clear, when I say all potential candidates, I mean all reasonable candidates. I will not include generic, nameless characters like Frogget, and I won't include similarly generic characters like Task, but if a character
Task? But that's a Darkner. How would a Darkner be the knight? And also, now that you've said that, you know for a fact that, you know, it's going to turn out that the knight actually was a Frogget all along. It's going to be like a weird named Frogget that we only meet like in the last chapter of the game or something like that. It's going to be horrible.
Has a confirmed name and are more significant to the plot than Jigsaw Joe, then I'll probably discuss them in this video. That includes Undertale characters who have yet to appear in Deltarune, such as Papyrus, Kara, and Gaster. Minor NPCs with next to no characterization, like this clam girl or this rabbit girl, won't be included in this discussion, as there's nothing I can really say about them.
And yet, the video is still, you know, 3.5 hours long, so Jaru's really going in deep for this one. So Jaru's really going in depth for this one.
And of course, it wouldn't be a Jaru video if I didn't discuss some insane theory of mine, so at the very end of this video, I will give you my very own theory regarding who and what the knight truly is.
Oh god, wait a second, I think I remember somebody saying, isn't this the video where, like some character, like something Smog is, it was like Elias Smog or something like that. Oh no.
And spoiler alert, you've definitely never heard my knight theory anywhere else before. For starters, let's discuss everything we know about the Roaring Knight at this point in time. The knight was first introduced in Chapter 1 by Sham, who mentions that a strange knight appeared recently. This knight is responsible for upsetting the balance of power in the Card Kingdom, as 3 of the kings were locked up shortly after the knight's arrival. Sham then has this strangely worded line where he says that, quote, the remaining king put him and his strange son into power. This line has multiple interpretations due to its confusing wording. The most likely interpretation is that the him in this sentence is referring to the Spade King, and the strange son is Lancer.
You guys think about, but if the previous sentence was talking about the knight, the remaining king put him and his strange son. Honestly, this entire thing would be, put to rest if it was put himself and his strange son into power. Otherwise, this kind of sounds like the knight was the king and Lancer is the... It's okay, already, this is weird. I don't remember this line.
However, there are other ways to interpret this line, which we will discuss later in the video. The next time we hear mention of the knight is from the three kings who mention being imprisoned by the knight. Shortly after, we hear more in the battle against the Spade King. He mentions that he will shatter Chris's heart to pieces by the knight's will. This could be his way of saying that the knight specifically wants Chris dead, but it could also just be that the Spade King wants Chris dead and that he's taking action out of loyalty to the knight. He goes on to say that the Darkners have found fresh purpose thanks to the appearance of the knight. He mentions that the knight pulls the fountains from the earth and that these fountains are holy. An interesting choice of words, given that the creation of the fountains will bring about the angels' heaven.
Actually thinking about it, that is one of the weird things, because seemingly, it's one of those things I never thought about, well, in really any real depth, but, the king really seems to be the only one in the entire kingdom that really seems, on board with the knight and, doing his thing. Because, honestly, all the other characters I can remember that were actually, loyal to the king were all kind of doing it just out of loyalty. They didn't want to attack, Chris, Susie, Rousey, the Lightners. They were just doing it because it was, their job or something like that, honestly. It's only, the king and Lancer that were really, in Lancer's case, quote-unquote, serious about the whole thing about following the knight.
The king then says that flooding the world with darkness will allow the Darkners to rule the world. Given that Rousey later states that creating these fountains would turn all the Darkners into stone, that would seem to suggest that either Rousey is lying to us, the Spade King was lied to by the knight, or the Spade King just leapt to conclusions similar to how the Queen leapt to conclusions in Chapter 2.
Yeah, again, that does make a lot... that third one especially does make a lot of sense. Because, oh god, what did they say? Because after the whole thing about Lightners turning to stone, there was a specific line about what would happen to the Darkners, and it didn't sound that good either. Oh god, what was it? The Titans will take form from the fountains, and envelop the land in devastation. Surviving Darkners crushed by the darkness will slowly, one by one, turn into statues, leaving the Lightners to fend for themselves. Okay, yeah, never mind. So it was the Darkners that would turn into stone, and the Lightners would just be kind of driven crazy.
Given that she didn't know about the roaring, it's probable that the Spade King doesn't know either.
Yeah,
the only other time we hear about the knight in Chapter 1 is after defeating Jevil. If you beat him non-violently, then he says that, from now, a nightmare will awaken in your hearts, in the shadow of the knight's hand. If you instead beat Jevil with violence, he says, the hand of the knight is drifting forward. Soon the queen returns, and hell's roar bubbles from the depths. The mentioning of hell in the context of the knight seems to further tie the knight to the angel from the prophecy and to the general religious symbolism surrounding the fountains. Also, both lines place emphasis on the knight's hand, which seems to be a recurring motif.
Well, considering, the whole thing, the whole thing was the knight or whoever creates the fountain stabs into the ground. Unless they have telekinesis, that seems to be the stabbing motion with the knife is kind of the important part, and again, hand for stabbing.
At the very least, this confirms that the knight has hands, which does actually narrow down the candidates a fair amount. As for
I guess so. I guess that
Hell's
couldn't be
roar
Monster
bubbling
Kid
from
then.
the
Yeah, I
depths,
guess.
we know that the apocalypse from Rousseau's prophecy is known as the Roaring, and that the night is known as the Roaring Night. So it's probable that Hell's roar is referring to that. In addition, I suspect that when it says from the depths, it's probably referring to whatever lies behind these doors south of town. The use of the word bubbles implies water, and Onion-san says that they have heard some old song from beneath the lake. This could be suggesting that there is some sort of underground facility that runs below the hometown, and Onion-san is hearing music coming from some chamber in that facility.
Oh god, it's Rapture, just like in BioShock. Instead of a lighthouse, it's the bunker south of town. You go inside and there's like a secret underground, well, not underwater city underneath the lake.
Jevil clearly connects the night with this facility and compares it to hell, although what this means in the greater narrative, I'm not sure. Something worth noting is that upon returning to Sham and asking him about Jevil, he has this to say. One day he met a strange someone, and since then he began to change. He started saying bizarre things that didn't completely make sense, but didn't completely not make sense either. Soon he began to see the world as a game, and everyone as its participants. As the court mage and his only companion, I was forced to lock him away. Or rather, lock us all away, in his own words. Since that time, the strange words he said have stuck inside my cotton, and my view of this world has become darker yet darker. This darker yet darker line is a direct reference to the journal entry written by W.D. Gaster in Undertale, which seems to imply that the strange someone Jevil mentions here is either Gaster or someone tied to Gaster. However, the reason I bring this up is because when talking about the night, Sham highlights their name in red. And yet, when talking about this strange someone, he does not do this. Furthermore, Jevil meeting this strange someone and getting locked away is specifically implied to have occurred a long time ago, while the night arriving is stated to be a recent occurrence. As such, it seems likely that the Roaring Night and the strange someone that Jevil met are not the same person.
So I guess that could, point to the whole thing of, of Gaster not being the Knight, but maybe the Knight works for Gaster. Like, maybe the Knight is like one of Gaster's followers, again, operating under the assumption we'll actually meet Gaster in this game, and he's not just being dangled on a string in front of us by Toby again.
Sham does refer to both characters as strange, so maybe they are connected in some way, but still, I don't think they are one in the same.
A little peculiar.
The next time we hear someone discuss the night is in Chapter 2, when it is brought up by the Sweet Cap and Cakes. They mention that the Queen became worse after the Dark Fountain showed up, and that she wouldn't stop talking about the night and the fountain. Note that they refer to the night as an it here. This could just be their gender-neutral term for the entity due to them not knowing anything about it, but you could interpret this as proof that the him being used in Sham's line was not, in fact, referring to the night. The next we hear of the night is from these butlers in Queen's Mansion, who are watching a video of the night creating the fountain. They say that the night created the fountain and this world, that it might be more powerful than Queen, and that this video shows the night creating this fountain by its own hand. Once again, we see this emphasis on the knight's hand, and once again, we see the knight referred to primarily as an it. After this, it's not until Queen's battle that we hear the knight mentioned again. In her initial battle, Queen mentions that the knight is the one who created this world, but she goes into far more detail afterwards. She says, "The night, the roaring night. Today it deigned to create this world. Reaching its long hand to the sky, it coursed its will into its blade, and made, thrusting the fountain from the earth. Unfortunately, the world they created is trapped within the confines of the library. If only we had a way to make more darkness, we might be able to cover the whole world. That is when I realized this power, this power of the will, this power of determination. Is this not something that all Lightners possess? If one was simply determined enough, could not anyone create a dark fountain? So then, if the night has taken its leave, then I will simply make a new one. There is a lot to break down here. First of all, this is the first time that we hear the night referred to as the Roaring Night. Ralsei later describes the apocalypse from the prophecy as the roaring, which suggests that the night is a harbinger of this apocalypse. Considering that the roaring is caused by creating dark fountains, which is the main thing the night has done, bringing about the roaring seems to be the night's goal. The queen didn't know about the roaring, and yet she still called the night the Roaring Night, which means the night likely referred to itself as the Roaring Night when it created the cyber world. This also may suggest that the queen actually met the night, which could potentially narrow down the candidates. Queen then mentions that the night created this world today. In the next line, we see further emphasis on the knight's hand, although this time they specifically describe its hand as being long. This is very important, as the more descriptions of the knight's appearance we get, the easier of a time we'll have narrowing down its identity.
Okay, now I'm wondering, like, how much is Jaru going to put into these descriptions of the knight's physical appearance? Because like a lot of this it's different from how Queen usually talks. It's a lot more poetic, a lot more not ethereal, but like a lot like there's almost a religious undertone to it. So I have to wonder, when they say, oh, long hand, are they being literal or metaphorical here? Because, I mean, you know, you could literally say, oh, the knight has, you know, a big wingspan and is able to reach very far with its long arms. Or this could be done more in a metaphorical sense where, oh, the knight's long hand was responsible for creating this entire world, or something like that. So,
The queen also mentions that the knight created the fountain by coursing its will, aka its determination, into its blade. First off, this confirms that the knight uses a blade of some sort, and if this image the queen creates is accurate, then it would appear that the knight not only uses a knife, but also has either 4 or 5 fingers.
Actually, I never thought of how you could show that as being. Honestly, that the way the lines are being used, they're being shown more to like limits and definitions, stuff like that. I don't think the lines themselves are the fingers. But I think whoever this knight is, if this is an accurate depiction, the knight might have 3 fingers. Well, 4 if you count the thumb, but you know.
Due to the abstract nature of this image, it's hard to tell exactly how many fingers are being depicted. If the straight lines represent fingers, then the knight has 5. But if this image is meant to be interpreted like this, then the knight has 4 fingers. I originally wrote this script with the assumption that the knight had 5 fingers, and then I had to rewrite the script once I realized that it might actually have 4.
Yeah.
I was very annoyed. This next line didn't make a ton of sense to me at first, as it seemed like broken English. Why would Toby Fox have this random, fractured sentence in the middle of the Queen's monologue? But then I remembered where I had heard this strange phrasing before. There's another character who uses the word made in a strange way. Or rather, another character who uses the word making in a strange way. I'm of course talking about Spamton. During the weird route, upon fighting Spamton, he rants at you for betraying him and then gives you this line of dialogue. No, I get it. It's you and that Hochi mama. You've been making, haven't you? You've been making hyperlink blocked. And now that you have your own supply, you don't need me. Honestly, you could spend a whole video just analyzing Spamton's bizarre dialogue, and you could spend another entire video trying to deduce what he's referring to when he says hyperlink blocked.
In fact, somebody already has, and I've done a reaction to that one. Oh god, well, who was it made by? I'm completely forgetting. Actually, never mind. It was literally Jaru as well. And actually, wait, when did? And in that video, Jaru worked out that it was most likely that he was talking about love.
Given what it means when a hyperlink is blocked on a computer, it's easy to assume that Spamton is trying to say something specific, but every time he tries to say it, he gets an error and it says hyperlink blocked instead. That said, I think it's clear that hyperlink blocked is usually used in a context in which it means something related to souls, determination, identity, freedom, or possibly just power. Of course, that's assuming that hyperlink blocked is replacing the word that Spamton actually wants to say. It's possible that when he says hyperlink blocked, he is doing so intentionally. As such, much like his other bizarre dialogue choices, I think we could possibly interpret hyperlink blocked literally in order to guess what he means. The first word is hyperlink, which is composed of the prefix hyper and the noun link. Hyper means to go over, beyond, above, or excessively more than normal.
Okay, when was this video made originally? 2 years ago, March 24th, 2022. When was the hyperlink blocked video originally made? September 2nd, 2023. Yeah, okay, so the hyperlink blocked video is obviously a lot newer. Okay. That explains it.
For example, Asriel's most powerful move, the Hyper Goner, is an attack that can wipe out an entire timeline, so it makes sense that he'd use the hyper prefix. The next word, link, means a relationship between two things or situations, especially when one thing affects the other. As such, the literal interpretation of hyperlink is a connection between two things that goes beyond normal. Combine that with the second word, blocked, and it seems like Spamton wants to block some sort of unusual connection. Given that he is obsessed with cutting the strings that make him a puppet, it's likely that he wants the power of determination in order to block the link to whatever entity is controlling his fate. So, when he says that Chris also wants hyperlink blocked, it's likely because he can tell that Chris is also being puppeted by some other entity, and thus Chris also wants to block their own hyperlink. Point is, it's likely that both Queen and Spamton are referencing very similar things when using the words made and making. Specifically, they're likely referring to determination, as that's the power needed to create fountains, that's the power that can change fate, and that's the power that Chris is probably building inside of Noelle. I kind of got sidetracked a little to talk about Spamton, but to tie this all back to the Knight, we now know that the Knight is capable of wielding determination, which means that the Knight probably has a soul. Which means that the Knight is probably a Lightner. Which means that the Knight is probably a character we've met in the hometown of Deltarune.
You know, all of that to say what was, already kind of obvious, because I mean, obviously we've seen that when a Darkner leaves the Dark World, they just turn back into the object that they are based off of. And with the sole exception of seemingly Rouse, which we have no idea how he travels from Dark World to Dark World, like whether he just teleports or if he's somehow able to leave or something like that. But, like, I was never under the impression that the Knight was a Darkner, because that just doesn't seem capable of, that just doesn't seem possible.
I say probably because, as we saw in Undertale, it is possible for an entity without a soul to wield determination. However, in Flowey's case, that was only possible because he had been injected with determination. And while there are a lot of similarities between Darkners and Flowey, I think it's safe to say that Darkners do not wield determination in the same way that Flowey did. That said, thanks to having Flowey as an example, we know that it is in fact possible for a soulless entity to steal souls and become more powerful as a result. So, Spamton did actually have the right idea. If he had succeeded in stealing Chris's soul, he likely would have been capable of entering the light world, despite not having a soul of his own, which is a scary thought.
Yeah, but the only problem there is, unfortunately for Spamton, then we would have been in control of him. And I don't think he'd be happy about that.
But it does show that, theoretically, a Darkner could be the Roaring Knight and be responsible for creating fountains if they somehow gained the soul or the determination of a Lightner. Recall that the Spade King adores the Knight despite hating Lightners, so that could be argued to be evidence that the Knight is not a Lightner. The only other notable...
Well, I mean... Again, given that seemingly the two monarchs we've run into, King and Queen, are working with limited information here, it could potentially be said that, at least for the King, he might not know that the Knight is a Lightner. Like, oh god, what was it? There was that one, a Deltarune comic I read. It was like, that one fan comic, Paper Trail, that was it. And quite literally, there's a bit in there depicting, like, if the Knight comes back, and, like, the King is like, oh, you've come back, and then the Knight takes off their mask, and he's shocked. It's like, well, you're a Lightner. It's like, how could you? Because, again, he was angry at the Lightners. He might not be he literally might not know that, the Knight is a Lightner.
Details that we can find in the Queen's speech is the fact that she refers to the Knight with gender-neutral pronouns, and she mentions that the Knight has taken its leave. Unfortunately, we have no way of knowing if the gender-neutral pronouns mean anything, as she could just be using such terms because the Knight wears metal armor that conceals their identity and gender. Speaking of which...
Again, wouldn't be the first time. I mean, I remember back in, Undertale, the first time I played it, wasn't really sure what Undyne was before, people started actually, confirming that Undyne was female, because that armor is a lot bigger than Undyne.
It is possible that the Knight wears the armor of a knight, and while this isn't confirmed, Chris gained armor simply by entering the Dark World, so a character doesn't necessarily need to own any armor in the Light World in order to gain the armor of a knight upon entering the Dark World.
Yep.
That said, if a character does own armor in the Light World, or owns something that the Dark World might convert into armor, that would certainly improve their chances of being the Knight. And with that, there's no further mention of the Knight thus far in Deltarune. That said, I do need to point out one other piece of evidence that should help us narrow down the candidates. Specifically, we know that the Knight created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain and the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. And while we don't know when the Card Kingdom was created, we do know when the Cyberworld was created. Quain specifically mentions that this dark world was created today, which narrows it down a little bit. But more importantly, Berdly and Noelle wind up in this dark world. It seems exceedingly unlikely that either of them would jump into a dark world the way Chris and Susie do.
Again, and there's that whole theory about the Dark World possibly being made while they were in the room by, whoever was potentially hiding in this closet, if somebody was. So there's that. It has to be somebody that could easily fit in the closet, potentially at the very least.
And since they're literally sitting at the table when the Dark Fountain is sealed, this suggests that they had sat down before the Dark World was created. Furthermore, this closet specifically has text that says that a large person could fit in there, which seems to be hinting that the Knight was hiding in this room and created the fountain after Noelle and Berdly sat down. This is further supported by the fact that Rouse mentions sensing a dark presence and hurrying over, which implies that the Dark Fountain was created shortly after Chris and Susie left the castle town, as Rouse never mentions sensing such a presence beforehand. Considering Noelle is still very close to the entrance of the cyberworld when we find her, this further supports the notion that the fountain was created only a few minutes before Chris and Susie arrived. This suggests that the sequence of events went something like this. The knight enters the computer lab and hides in the closet. Noelle and Berdly enter the computer lab and sit down. At the same time, Chris and Susie enter the castle town and hang out for a minute. They then leave the castle town and start heading towards the library. The knight creates the dark fountain, tells Queen that it is known as the Roaring Night, and then quickly flees the computer lab. Queen analyzes her new situation and then enacts her plan to collect lighteners and create another Roaring Night. Ralsei immediately senses the creation of a new dark fountain and hurries over to investigate.
Again,
Chris
somehow.
and Susie then narrowly miss the night and enter the library. They then enter the cyberworld and stumble across a very confused Noelle, who is then captured by Queen. Ralsei then catches up with the party. This seems to be the complete sequence of events. With this timeline established, we should be able to rule out a number of characters who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time to create the cyberworld Dark Fountain. So, with all that evidence on the table, let's discuss the potential candidates. Like I said
we're only
before,
now
I will
getting the
be
candidates.
including all
Jesus,
of the
video's gonna be
important
long.
named characters, even if they haven't actually appeared in the plot, which includes Darkners like Ralsei, Lancer, and Spamton. Even though Darkners probably can't wield determination, they can steal souls, which means that in theory, much like Flowey, a Darkner could create dark fountains if they manage to steal the soul of a Lightener.
Again, I'm not buying that it's a Darkner that's the knight. It just doesn't fit in with basically anything.
Since Toby Fox has introduced this plot device, we have to assume it's possible, and thus I will be including the Darkners in this analysis. Each character will be analyzed in 3 ways: means, motive, and opportunity. When discussing means, I will go over whether the candidate matches the physical description of the knight and whether they have the ability to create dark fountains. When discussing motive, I will go over whether a candidate could have any reason for bringing about the roaring, and if so, what that reason might be. And when discussing opportunity, I will go over whether they could have been in the right place at the right time to create the dark worlds. Oh, also, for each candidate, I will be ranking them in a tier list that represents how likely I think they are to be the
You gotta
knight.
have the good old tier list.
A tier means they are a compelling and reasonable option. B tier means they are a flawed but reasonable option. C tier means it's technically possible but dubious. D tier means it's extremely unlikely, while F tier
Is
means
impossible,
it's
yeah.
downright impossible for that character to be the knight. With all that preliminary stuff out of the way, I will
That
now
was all
discuss
preliminary.
in alphabetical order every single
we're going in
option
alphabetical
within
order.
reason
Okay, too.
regarding the true identity of the Roaring Knight. First up is Alphys. Starting with means, as far as physical appearance is concerned, the knight has long arms, while Alphys is smaller than Chris. She also
she's
isn't
rather
known
short.
to wear armor, although she is known to build robots, so maybe she could build some sort of mecha suit that she could disguise herself with while in the dark world. She is certainly
wouldn't that be a
known for
visual?
being rather deceptive, so that's not completely outside her characterization, and she also has 4 fingers, which could be enough to match the knight. Alphys is a Lightener, so it is feasible that she could create a dark fountain, although whether she has enough determination to pull that off is debatable. She's not exactly a strong-willed person. She's also not known to wield a knife. In terms of motive, Alphys doesn't seem to be a religious type, so her wanting to bring about the angel's heaven seems unlikely, and while she has been known to cause problems for other people, it was always on accident, so it seems unlikely that she would try to bring about the end of the world.
I mean, that being said, she is a little obsessed with anime, so maybe she's just trying to recreate Evangelion. Who knows?
Admittedly, she does betray her people and help Frisk in Undertale, but to be fair, she was just helping an innocent child get home, so that's not exactly an evil act on its own.
Yeah.
And while she may have scientific motivations for creating dark fountains, I think she's a bit too timid to pursue such an endeavor. As for opportunity, she definitely had the chance to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, as she literally works
She's a
at
teacher,
the school,
yeah.
but given that the grand doors were left open, and Rousey could see the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain in the distance, it stands to reason that the knight likely knew about Rousey's dark world existing inside of the supply closet. As such, it seems unlikely that Alphys would intentionally endanger Chris and Susie by sending them to the supply closet where she likely knows there's a dark world.
I mean, unless she did it on purpose and she specifically wanted Chris and Susie to go into the dark world. You never know.
Even if she is the knight, I don't buy that she would put any children in immediate danger, especially if that child belongs to Asgore, who she has a crush on, or to Toriel, who is probably one of the only people to treat her kindly, and is literally the person who got Alphys her teaching job.
You never know, she might be really sick.
If Alphys would have the chance to get to the library before Noelle and Berdly. We say goodbye to Alphys right here, walk down the hall, have a conversation with Noelle, and then she immediately departs for the library. Could Alphys, with her stubby legs, really get to the library before Noelle? Plus, we don't see Berdly, which implies he has already left for the library, so Alphys would have to beat him there and hide in the closet without him noticing her. Does she really have time to pull all this off? Well, it's debatable. I would argue against it, but it's not impossible. She does own a bicycle after all, and she is gone from her classroom during the time when this would all be going down. She later crashes into Undyne, which is implied to happen sometime after we enter the library, as prior to that point in time, Undyne was still clearing traffic and nobody had gotten hurt yet. As such, it could be that Alphys fled the library after creating the Dark Fountain and was in such a hurry to get away that she crashed her bike. But to be honest, none of that seems particularly in character for Alphys, and you could easily argue that her being with Undyne counts as an alibi in favor of her not being the knight. Also, if she really is the knight, then she is doing a shockingly good job of not hinting at that fact in her dialogue. As when you discuss the fact that you went to the library where she supposedly made this latest dark fountain, she doesn't panic or act suspicious, and instead just rambles about the anime reviews. The Alphys we knew from Undertale was a terrible liar, and you could easily tell when she was concealing something. So it seems unlikely that her dialogue would be so inconspicuous if she really was the knight.
You know what's funny? All this talk of the knight, and I had never actually, contemplated the thought of Alphys being the knight. But now the only thing I can think of is, like, if Alphys actually was the knight, what would she look like? And the only thing I can think of is, like, that one design for what Alphys looked like in Underswap, where she's, like, has the axe, and, like, she's, like, wearing the breastplate, but her arms are uncovered and stuff like that. Like, that's the only thing I can think of, and it's really funny.
Overall, Alphys does not match the physical description of the knight, does not seem to have any reason to be pursuing the Roaring, and it's debatable if she had the opportunity to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. As such, I would say it's extremely unlikely that Alphys is the knight, which puts her in D tier. Side note, did anyone else notice that Asgore is the one who hires Alphys in Undertale, while Toriel is the one who gets her hired in Deltarune? That's a cool little detail. Next up is the annoying dog.
Why do I get the feeling that if Asgore was still, working for the police department, he would have somehow gotten her a job in the police department, maybe not as a cop, but maybe as a secretary or something like that. I don't know.
The annoying dog has a shocking amount of evidence supporting it being, which makes him the only S tier option in. Oh
god, wouldn't that just be it? Like, all these people theorizing, and it turns out the knight was actually Toby Fox the entire time. I mean, I guess that makes sense.
In this video. Next up is the king under the mountain, Asgore. Starting with means, Asgore definitely matches the physical description of the knight. He has 5 fingers, he has quite long arms, is known to wear the armor of a knight, and is known to wield various weapons both for combat and for gardening. It's highly probable that the worn dagger was a weapon given to Kara by Asgore, so it's entirely possible that Asgore could own such a weapon as well. Notably, the closet in the computer lab specifically says that a large person could easily fit inside, and there are very few people larger than Asgore. Also, I definitely say that Asgore has enough determination to potentially create a dark fountain, as he had the strength to govern his people for millennia in the Undertale timeline. In terms of motive, Toriel definitely seems to be the religious type, so it's feasible that Asgore is as well. As such, it's quite possible that he might have religious reasons to bring about the angels' heaven through the roaring.
I mean, he might be just, thinking about it, he might just literally be very depressed, like, oh god, heaven, it has to be better than this. I'm gonna bring on the apocalypse. Like my wife took the kids. No!
It wouldn't be the first time that Asgore has ended up as the main antagonist, despite having good intentions. Even without the religious angle, Asgore's life is in such shambles that he'd have plenty of reasons to want to shake things up. I mean, he's divorced, he has no house or bed, he's on the verge of losing his business, he's a disgraced former police chief, and his best friend is slowly dying in the hospital. Needless to say, things aren't exactly going well for Asgore, which could work as motivation for pursuing the roaring. In terms of opportunity, Asgore would have plenty of chances to enter the library and hide in the closet in the computer lab, but he would have much fewer opportunities to sneak into the school. Although, since his ex-wife works at the school, it's conceivable that he might know a thing or two about when the best time is to sneak in. That said, the one issue with Asgore creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is that he would likely have been spotted by Undyne upon leaving, who we know was directing traffic at the time. And given how he's her former boss and a rather conspicuous character, you'd think she'd have something to say about that. Then again, Asgore is notably absent for the majority of Chapter 2. You can't even enter his flower shop. As such, you could argue that his absence is due to him being the knight. And unlike Alphys, Asgore would have no idea that Chris was one of the kids who keeps falling into these dark worlds. Although, that does bring us to the first major issue with Asgore being the knight. Why on earth would a kind-hearted man like Asgore create dangerous dark fountains in a school and in a library where children often frequent?
I mean, I could potentially see it as, again, like going on the theme of, everybody's operating on, like, limited and incomplete knowledge here. I mean, if Asgore actually is the knight, maybe it could be that, again, he doesn't know about the prophecy of the roaring either. I mean, granted, from what we've seen, like, they may be dangerous, but also the Dark Worlds are a lot of fun. So, maybe potentially he created them, like, in places where kids frequent because, well, as I said, he's kind of lost his kids. So maybe he just wants to create, and maybe the thought process behind it is he literally just wants to, create these fantastical worlds where kids could go on adventures and stuff like that. Who knows?
Even if things are going terribly for him, we've seen Asgore at much lower points in his life, and he would never intentionally endanger a child like that. He felt deeply guilty about killing human children in Undertale, despite everything humanity had done to them, and in Deltarune, he'd have way less justification for putting kids in harm's way.
Very much so, yeah.
This is the same man who dressed up as Santa Claus in Undertale and who was the police chief not too long ago. So from a purely character standpoint, I find it incredibly hard to believe that Asgore would risk the lives of these kids in his hometown. Overall, Asgore is a perfect match for the knight's appearance. He's certainly got the motivation to bring about the roaring, and he's given plenty of opportunities to make these dark fountains. However, endangering children seems so out of character for Asgore that I find him being the knight a hard pill to swallow. Also, that would make Asgore the primary antagonist for the second game in a row, which I don't really think Toby Fox would do. The impression I always got was that Asgore has to be at the worst possible point in his life before he'd be a threat to anyone. So, as it stands, I would say Asgore is definitely a feasible candidate, but not one that I personally think makes much sense. So, let's put him in B tier. Next up is the prince of the Dreamer household, Asriel. As for means, much like his father, Asriel has 5 fingers, long arms, and is known to use bladed weaponry.
The only problem is he's not in town. Again, going back to my reaction, the previous reaction I did just a little bit ago, talking about, like Rousey being, actually made from Asriel's corpse and stuff like that. Supposedly, Asriel is in college, and people know he's in college and expect him to come back. Unless, somebody going to college is some sort of massive metaphor that doesn't actually mean what it means. I don't see him being the knight unless he somehow snuck his way back into town a week early without, anybody seeing him.
Admittedly, Asriel is not known to wear armor, but he is known to have a great deal of determination, so it's quite believable that he could create a dark fountain. In terms of motive, Asriel is arguably even more religious than Toriel, as Asriel would regularly go confess for Chris's sins, despite that not being a concept in their religion, and he was a member of the church choir. As it stands, with the exception of Father Alvin himself, Asriel has shown the most devotion to the angel religion out of any character in Deltarune, and thus he could have religious motivation to bring about the angels' heaven. That said, if we don't include the religious angle, there's not much incentive for Asriel to pursue such a goal. As far as we know, Asriel's life is pretty good, so it's hard to imagine he'd want to shake up the status quo. Even if he created the Dark Worlds in order to help his sibling in some way, that doesn't change the fact that Asriel is a pretty ethical person, and much like Asgore, I can't really imagine that he would endanger children by creating these dark fountains. As for opportunity, this is where it gets especially sketchy. Asriel supposedly isn't even in town, so if he really is away at college, then that would mean he literally couldn't be the knight. However, if that alibi is a lie and Asriel has secretly snuck back to town, then theoretically he could sneak into the school and create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is a much more dubious affair.
Yeah, very much so.
Not only would Asriel have to sneak in and out without being seen in the middle of the day, but he would also then have to hide his identity throughout the rest of the town in order to avoid revealing that he had come back from college. If there was some mysterious person hanging around town hiding their identity, wouldn't someone have noticed and commented on it? Overall, Asriel mostly matches the knight's description, could potentially have a religious motive for bringing about the roaring, and he could theoretically sneak around town creating fountains without being seen, but he is not known to wear armor, he is generally too ethical to endanger the lives of children, and he already has a fairly strong alibi due to him being supposedly away at college. Also, if Asriel was the knight, then that would make him the primary antagonist again, which, much like Asgore, I find to be a dubious prospect. As such, I'd say Asriel is technically an option, but an unlikely one, and thus ends up in C tier. Next is everyone's favorite alpha gamer, Berdly. As for means, this one is rather tricky, as Berdly doesn't really have fingers, so that part is already dubious. But as far as long...
I mean, granted, it really depends on how you want to count, like, the ends of his wings. Because, like, we've kind of seen where he holds stuff. So, like, do you want to do kind of like the cartoony where, like, the tips of the wings and the feathers kind of, like, act as fingers? And that kind of counts? Or are we not doing that?
Long arms are concerned, he is taller than Chris. In addition, he wears armor like a knight, he literally refers to himself as a knight, and he does technically use a bladed weapon, although it's not a knife. He also seems confident that he could create a dark fountain at the end of Chapter 2, so that part seems to check out. In terms of motive, Berdly very effectively presents his reasons for wanting to cover the world in darkness. He thought it would create a utopia for the smart people of the world. That part is fairly well laid out. The only issue is that, presumably, the Knight is an ongoing threat, whereas Berdly has largely been neutralized as an antagonist by the end of Chapter 2.
Unless, you know, he was lying, but also that does kind of go into the whole, you know, multiple Knights theory, though then again, the way he acted before, I mean, either he's putting on a really good show, or he had, like, his split personalities, and, like, one's Berdly, one's the Knight. Ooh, who knows?
So if he really is the Knight, then he'd probably have to possess a secret reason for wanting the Roaring, now that he actually knows what it is. But based off his characterization, it feels like his character arc is largely complete. Of course, this could be a ruse on Toby Fox's part, but unless Berdly has hidden depths that we haven't even begun to understand, it seems like him being defeated so early in the game wouldn't really make sense if he actually was the Knight. In terms of opportunity, Berdly is a student at the school, so he could certainly have had the opportunity to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, as far as the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is concerned, that part really doesn't add up.
No,
when
definitely.
the fountain is sealed, Berdly appears in the middle of the room, not in the closet. And if he had created the Dark Fountain, then Noelle would have seen him. Similarly, the Queen clearly saw, or heard, or possibly even met the Roaring Knight, and says that the Knight took its leave.
Yeah, so it'd be unless Berdly somehow changed his appearance or his costume or whatever, it's very hard to believe that, you know, Queen would believe that, you know, Berdly and the Knight were two separate people.
Which means that she, more so than anybody, should have been able to realize that Berdly was the Knight, especially after how long she spends in his company. Furthermore, the Spade King clearly had the opportunity to interact with the Knight, as the Knight is the one that put him into power, and with all due respect to Berdly, I can't really imagine the Spade King worshipping at the shrine of a pro gamer. I don't think the Spade King would have even a single ounce of respect for some know-it-all Lightner brat.
Yeah,
overall,
definitely.
Berdly calls himself a knight, dresses like a knight, has an established motivation to bring about the Roaring, wields a bladed weapon, and he is seemingly capable of creating dark fountains. However, he doesn't have fingers, doesn't use a knife, has already had a character arc, has already been defeated, is not recognized by Queen, was in the wrong place to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, and is not the kind of person that the Spade King would respect. Oh, also, you can kill him in the Snowgrave route.
So either that kind of moves, you know, the weird route even weirder, so that either Chris starts creating all of the dark fountains, or Berdly comes back from the dead. So Zombie Knight. No, Night of the Living Dead.
And I don't think the Roaring Knight can be murdered in Chapter 2. As such, while not completely impossible, I find it extremely unlikely that Berdly could be the Knight, and thus he ends up in D tier. Next up is Bratty. I can't believe I included her and Caddy on this list, but here we go. In terms of means, she is not a knight, nor has she ever worn armor, and she's never used a weapon of any kind, including a knife. That said, she does have long arms, she has at least 4 fingers, and since she's an alligator, it could be argued that her scales are a form of natural armor. It's debatable if she has any great amount of determination, but as a lightener, she seems like a viable candidate for being able to create Dark Fountain. In terms of motive, I really have no idea. If someone like Berdly ended up being the knight, I feel like they'd have to be a puppet that was being tricked and manipulated, as
Gaster!
otherwise
No.
I can't really see her having any reason or capability to bring about the roaring. Also, if the Spade King respecting Berdly seemed like a dubious concept, then him respecting Berdly seems even more absurd. I don't know why she would choose the school and the library as places to create dark fountains. Maybe she hates kids.
Like a test
or
ground?
maybe she hates education. Given her Valley Girl persona, I wouldn't put it past her to be stupid and petty enough to do something like that, although that's hardly a strong argument for her being the knight. As for opportunity, Berdly doesn't seem to attend school, so I'm not sure if there's any obvious opportunity for her to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. She could feasibly create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain as it is inside a public library, although we never see her anywhere near that library, so even that option seems dubious. You'd expect her to create a dark fountain in her alleyway before creating it in random places like the library or school.
Yeah, that would make a lot more sense.
Berdly is not particularly knight-like. She has no clear motivation for pursuing such an endeavor, and perhaps more importantly, she is a joke side character who Toby Fox would almost certainly never make the antagonist of any game in a million years.
I mean,
It's
you
not
say that.
100% impossible, so I'll still put her in D tier, but please understand, she is light years less likely to be the knight than the other D tier candidates.
At that point,
Next
why not
up
just put
is
her
the
in F
most
then?
uncomfortably relatable character in fiction, Burgerpants, aka Pizza Pants. As for means, he only seems to have 3 fingers. He has nothing to do with the knights. He is never seen with a weapon, and I can't imagine that he has a great deal of determination. That said, he does have long arms, and it's possible that his Ice-E mascot suit could become a suit of armor in the Dark World and would help conceal his identity.
I mean, and also there is the whole thing about, you know, the whole, like, icy monster sightings. I mean, you never know. The knight and icy monster might be one and the same.
In terms of motive, very few characters have a life as consistently terrible as Burgerpants, so I would not put it past him to want to bring about the roaring in order to shake things up. Hilariously enough, one of his most iconic lines is that he can't go to hell because he's out of vacation days, which is a line Spamton references, and Jevil directly connects the concept of hell with the night. Actually, now that I think about it, Spamton and Burgerpants have a weird amount in common. Their faces are strangely similar in the shop. They both work in sales. They're both intensely expressive and cynical. They both talk about hell and vacation days. They both are prominently shown using phones, and they both want to be big shots. Dang. I don't know if that proves anything about Burgerpants being the knight, but it definitely makes me wonder if Burgerpants has some greater purpose in this narrative. I mean, we never find out his real name, right? That seems like a joke at first, but what if Toby Fox is using that joke to cover up the fact that Burgerpants fills a greater role in this story? Again, don't know if this is relevant to the knight, but being tied to another ambitious and powerful character like Spamton could definitely be used as evidence that Burgerpants may also be ambitious enough to be the knight. As for opportunity, this is where we reach issues with this theory.
Yeah.
Burgerpants has a day job and is not going to school, which means that he has very few opportunities to sneak off and create dark fountains.
Especially
of all the
ones
characters
in the
we've
school.
discussed thus far, Burgerpants has more ongoing responsibilities that keep him away from the rest of the town than anybody else, which definitely hurts the idea that he might be the knight. If he was working at his day job, he couldn't have been creating the cyberworld. Overall, Burgerpants definitely has the motive and the disposition to bring about the roaring, and I'm beginning to think there's more to him than meets the eye, but his minimal number of fingers, his lack of weapons and armor, and his lack of opportunity to create these dark fountains makes him a rather unlikely candidate for being the knight.
I mean, again, they're pointing back to that whole Cammy Boy G video I watched, where it was talking about how, you know, Burgerpants is one of the knights, if there's multiple.
I'll go ahead and put him in C tier.
Really?
Next is the first Darkner on our list, Cap'n. Cap'n is the only member of the Sweet Cap'n Cakes to have 5 fingers. He is made of metal, so that could potentially make him knight-like, and he seems to have decently long arms. However, he does not wield a knife, and he doesn't really seem confident enough to steal a human soul, which makes it seem rather unlikely that he would be capable of creating a dark fountain. It's also unclear why he would bother creating a dark fountain in the empty classroom at the school.
Or even if he could, because again, there's the whole thing that, you know, the world he was created in and was after. So, like, I don't know, like, how would the timeline even work there?
Sham doesn't recognize him, and Cap'n doesn't seem to recognize Sham or Rule's card, it seems unlikely that Cap'n has ever been to the Card Kingdom. In terms of motive, Cap'n is a rebel, but he's only become a rebel recently. For the most part, he's just a musician, and seeing as he's part of a trio, it seems like he has a fairly sweet life, so it's hard to see why or how he'd go about becoming the knight. He also, at one point, literally says, "What does that knight have that I don't?" Which could be a cover-up line on his part, but I honestly have my doubts that Cap'n is smart enough to conceal such an elaborate ruse. As for opportunity, Cap'n certainly could have created the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, but him creating the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain seems dubious at best, especially considering he's part of a band. If he's part of a band, wouldn't his friends notice if he left to go create a dark world and overthrow the Card Kingdom monarchy? Seems like there's too many eyes on him for that to entirely make sense. Overall, while Cap'n matches 1 or 2 of the physical details of the knight, him being a rather unassuming Darkner with no clear connections to any existing Lighteners,
and
makes
again,
it feel
him being
rather
just a Darkner
unlikely
in general
that he is secretly the Roaring Knight. Plus, if he really was the Roaring Knight, then why would he help Chris defeat the Queen in the final battle? The Queen was trying to create more dark fountains, so helping the Delta warriors seems irrational if he really was the knight. Also, he's clearly an inconsequential comedic side character, so I sincerely doubt he holds any greater meaning in this story. As such, I think Cap'n is a solid D tier. And since it's not really worth my time to discuss all 3 of these characters separately, I'll go ahead and put Sweet and KK right there next to him, as none of them really make sense to be the knight. Next up is the younger sister of Caddy, Caddy. Caddy's hands are never seen in clear detail, but her older sister has 4 digits on each paw, so Caddy is probably the same, which is enough to match the knight. Her arms are arguably long, and she certainly seems determined enough to create dark fountains if push came to shove. That said, she has nothing to do with armor or weapons or knives, and technically she has paws, not hands.
I mean, the whole thing, she does work in a diner, you know, a lot of cutlery. She could have literally just grabbed a knife from there. Or, you know, the kitchen as well. And that is it for now, unfortunately. This is, of course, a part of a much larger reaction, so link to the next part should be appearing, you know, somewhere over my face, as well as in the corner of the video. I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you in the next part. See ya!